Mason just signed a stack of papers that plunged him another $200,000 into debt, and he walked out smiling like he'd just won the lottery. His checking account didn't drop one bit. His net worth, though, jumped up immediately. A few doors down, Walter hasn't owed anybody a single dollar in 9 years. He checks his flawless credit score the way some people check lottery numbers, and while he's doing that, he's quietly going broke standing perfectly still. I'm Root, and I've spent a ridiculous chunk of my life figuring out why the guy cheerfully buried in loans keeps outpacing the debt-free guy who supposedly did everything right. Here's what nobody says out loud: Mason didn't get wealthy despite his debt. He got wealthy because of it. He understood something Walter never will: there are two totally different species of debt, and only one of them is quietly trying to destroy you. Today I'll walk you through 6 ways ordinary people use the good kind to build real wealth. Let's dig in. Before anyone loses it in the comments, let's get one thing straight. When I say debt can make you rich, I'm not talking about your credit card balance. I'm not talking about the 28% interest you're still paying on a sofa you bought back in 2022. That kind of debt is a money-eating parasite, and if you're carrying it, everything else in this video has to wait until you've killed it off. What I'm describing here is an entirely different creature. The cleanest way to separate the two: bad debt buys things that lose value and bleed your bank account every month. Good debt buys things that either grow in value or pay you just for owning them. That's the whole distinction. And here's the statistic that flipped my thinking the first time I saw it. You'd assume rich households are drowning in debt, leveraged to the max. It's actually the reverse. Federal Reserve figures show the wealthiest households carry far less debt relative to their assets, around 12% for the top slice of earners, compared with well over 60% for a typical middle-class household. The wealthy borrow less proportionally, and they get richer doing it, because it was never about the size of the loan. It was about where they pointed it. Walter never grasped that distinction. He heard debt is bad once, probably from some radio host, and built his whole identity around dodging it. Mason heard the exact same warning and asked one better question: which kind? Hang on to that question, because by the end it's worth roughly 8 times Walter's net worth. So let's break down exactly where Mason pointed his borrowed money, starting with the oldest leverage trick in the book. Way 1 is real estate, and it tops the list for good reason: it's the most accessible serious leverage an average person can actually get their hands on. Here's the trick: when Mason buys a rental property, he doesn't pay for the whole thing. He puts down 20%, and the bank covers the rest. But, and this is the part that messes with people's heads, he keeps 100% of the appreciation. Let's run the numbers. The property costs $250,000. Mason puts down $50,000. It appreciates a modest 5% that year, or $12,500. If he'd paid the whole thing in cash, that's a plain 5% return, fine, unremarkable. But he didn't pay cash. He put in $50,000, so that same $12,500 gain is actually a 25% return. Same house, same year, same market, he multiplied his return 5-fold using the bank's money. And that's before a tenant even moves in and starts paying down his mortgage balance with their own paycheck every month. Fast forward 10 years on that single property, it's worth roughly $340,000. The loan balance has dropped to about $166,000, and Mason's equity, his actual slice, sits around $180,000. His original $50,000 turned into $180,000, largely funded by somebody else's paycheck. If you've ever wondered why landlords always seem a little too relaxed, that's why. Now for the hard part, because leverage is a blade that cuts both ways, and I don't want anyone emailing me from bankruptcy court. That same multiplier runs in reverse. If the house drops 20% instead of climbing, Mason's entire $50,000 down payment is wiped out completely. And that's not some hypothetical, it's a documentary. It's called 2008, when millions of overleveraged owners watched their equity vanish while the bank still came knocking for payment. Leverage doesn't care about your feelings. But bought right and held through the rough stretches, it's a wealth-building machine. Mason can even refinance, pull his original $50,000 back out tax-free, a loan isn't income, and redeploy it. Investors have a name for this loop: buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat, often shortened to BRRRR. Mason buys a rundown property cheap, fixes it up so it's worth more, rents it out, then refinances against the new higher value and pulls his original cash back out to do it all again. Same $50,000, recycled into a second property, then a third. He isn't saving up for each purchase, he's reusing one down payment on a loop. Meanwhile, Walter is saving up to buy a single rental property in cash sometime around his 65th birthday. By then, Mason owns 6 of them. Which brings us to way 2, quietly the most powerful item on this list, using debt to buy an existing business. Let me put the scary part up front this time so nobody accuses me of burying it. Businesses fail, a lot of them. Roughly half shut down within 5 years, and 2/3 within 10. Okay, warning label duly applied. Here's why this is still the mechanism that mints more everyday millionaires than almost anything else. Most people assume you have to start a business from nothing, live on instant noodles for 4 years, and hope for the best. You don't. You can buy one that's already running, already has customers, already turns a profit, mostly using borrowed money. That's exactly what an SBA loan is for. The Small Business Administration backs loans that let an ordinary person buy a cash-flowing business with as little as 10% down. Picture a boring, unglamorous winner, a laundromat, a plumbing company, a pest control route earning $200,000 a year and selling for $800,000. Mason doesn't need $800,000. He needs about $80,000. He borrows the rest, and then the business's own profits pay back the loan. Sit with that, because it's the entire game, the asset pays for itself. Mason puts in $80,000, and the thing he bought generates the cash that clears the debt he used to buy it. Loan paid off, and he owns an $800,000 cash-generating business for 1/10 of the sticker price. This same move, scaled up with billions of dollars and much nicer suits, is exactly what private equity firms do. A leveraged buyout is just a fancy term for borrowing most of the purchase price, buying the company, and letting the company's own earnings pay off its own acquisition. They call it a strategy. It's the same hustle. Buying an already profitable business tilts the odds in your favor compared with starting from zero. You're buying proven cash flow instead of a hope and a logo. But tilts the odds is not the same as guarantees. If that laundromat's revenue dries up, the loan payment shows up anyway, every month, with the patience of a horror movie villain. The line Walter never crossed was simple: he assumed you needed money to own a business. For Mason, the business itself was how he got the money. Way 3 is where things get a little sneaky, and it's the one the genuinely wealthy lean on hardest: borrowing against assets instead of selling them. It goes by a name that sounds like a heavy metal album: buy, borrow, die. Here's how it actually works, and it's simpler than it sounds. Mason has been running the real estate playbook and investing alongside it for years, so say his combined portfolio is now worth $5 million, and he originally put in $1 million. If he sells to raise cash, he owes capital gains tax on the $4 million in profit, a bill somewhere around $950,000. Nearly $1 million gone just for touching his own money. So instead, he doesn't sell. He walks into a bank and says, "I've got $5 million in assets, lend against it." The bank hands him a loan at, say, 6%, using the portfolio as collateral. On $3 million borrowed, that's $180,000 a year in interest. Line those numbers up: $950,000 in tax if he sells, versus $180,000 in interest if he borrows. And here's the kicker: his $5 million stays fully invested in growing the entire time he's spending the borrowed cash. He gets to use his wealth without selling it, without triggering the tax bill, and without stepping out of the market. Borrowed money isn't income, so none of it is taxed at all. Then comes the morbid final step, the die part. When Mason passes away, his heirs inherit the assets, and thanks to a rule called the step-up in basis, the $4 million in gains he never paid tax on simply disappears. Legally, the slate wipes clean. The estate settles the loan, the family keeps the rest, and the tax collector never gets a cut. This isn't some loophole discovered in a dusty basement, it's how people like Larry Ellison and Elon Musk actually operate, pledging billions in shares as collateral rather than selling them. Should you, with an average portfolio, go pile onto margin this afternoon? Please, no. This strategy has teeth. If the market crashes and your collateral value drops, you get a margin call, the bank demanding its money back at the worst possible moment, forcing you to sell right into the crash, which is the financial equivalent of being told to bail water while somebody drills fresh holes in the hull. But the underlying principle is worth stealing. To the wealthy, selling is the last resort. Borrowing is the first move. Way 4 is something your parents probably stumbled into by accident without ever fully understanding it, and it might be the most quietly elegant item on this list: borrowing cheap to invest at a higher return, and letting inflation finish the job for free. The logic goes like this: if Mason's mortgage is locked at 3%, and the stock market historically returns around 10%, then every dollar he doesn't throw at paying off that mortgage early, and instead invests, earns him the gap between the two. Borrow at 3, earn at 10, that 7-point spread is essentially free money on paper. It's why financially savvy people are oddly in no rush to pay off a cheap mortgage early. Walter hurled every spare dollar at his 3% loan because, in his words, debt bad. Mason kept the cheap loan and invested the difference instead. Over 30 years, that single decision is worth a small fortune. It only works, to be fair, if you actually stay invested through the ugly years instead of panic selling at the bottom. The spread rewards the patient and punishes the twitchy. But here's the part almost nobody appreciates, and it might be my favorite fact in all of personal finance: inflation quietly pays off your debt for you. Mason borrows a fixed amount today. His mortgage payment stays the exact same number every month for 30 years. But inflation makes every dollar worth a little less as time passes. His salary rises, rents rise, the price of a sandwich rises, and that mortgage payment just sits there frozen, getting easier to cover every single year. He's repaying tomorrow's expensive loan with money that keeps getting cheaper. Picture a $2,000 monthly payment. In year 1 it takes a real bite out of his paycheck, but 30 years later, after decades of raises and rising prices, that same $2,000 is what he leaves as a tip at a nice dinner. The number on the bill never changed. The world around it inflated, and the debt shrank in real terms every year he did absolutely nothing. The Federal Reserve has studied this directly. Inflation quietly transfers wealth from lenders to borrowers. The lender loses, the fixed-rate borrower wins. And the single biggest winner of the whole mechanism is the US government, sitting on tens of trillions of dollars in fixed-rate debt that inflation melts down like an ice sculpture at a summer wedding. If it's good enough for the Treasury, it's worth a second look. Way 5 is the least exciting to say out loud, and one of the most valuable in practice: using the kind of debt the tax code actually rewards you for carrying. Here's a rule that quietly runs the whole system: the interest on your credit card and your car loan is not deductible. You absorb that cost entirely on your own. The interest on a business loan or an investment property, on the other hand, is deductible. The government chips in. Same action, borrowing money and paying interest, but the tax code treats consumer debt like a vice and productive debt like a virtue. So when you're paying interest on that financed truck, you swallow the entire bill. When Mason pays interest on his rental, he writes it off, which quietly makes his real borrowing cost lower than the number printed on the loan. Then there's the real prize: depreciation. On that rental property, the tax code lets Mason deduct a portion of the building's value every year, as if it's wearing out, even though the property is actually climbing in value. On a $275,000 building, that works out to roughly $10,000 a year in deductions he claims without spending a single real dollar, a phantom expense that shields real income. Run the actual math: if Mason is in a 30% tax bracket, and between deductible interest and depreciation he's got $20,000 in write-offs, that's $6,000 the government simply doesn't collect from him every single year, for owning an asset that's appreciating the entire time. Walter, paying interest on his car loan, gets none of that. He writes the check and moves on. Mason's asset goes up in value, and on paper the government thinks he's losing money and rewards him for it anyway. Recent law made this sharper still. As of the 2025 tax legislation, businesses can once again write off 100% of certain purchases in the very first year, a provision called bonus depreciation that had been phasing out and was fully restored. Pair that with a strategy called cost segregation, and serious real estate investors can front-load enormous deductions, sometimes zeroing out their taxable income in the very year they buy. Quick honest footnote: because I'm not your accountant, tax law shifts constantly, so anything this specific is worth double-checking at the time you actually use it, not just when you're watching a video about it. And notice the pattern underneath all 6 of these strategies: the system isn't hiding any of it. It's written down publicly in the tax code. It just quietly rewards the person who borrows to build something over the person who borrows to buy something. That gap right there is the entire reason I built a school community. None of this is secret, it's just scattered across tax code, finance jargon, and gate-kept behind people who'd rather sell you a $1,900 course. Inside our school community, we break these exact mechanisms down into plain English and concrete steps, alongside people already running them instead of just talking about them. It's linked below, and it's built for anyone tired of watching this stuff from the sidelines. The first step costs you next to nothing. If any of this is landing, come see the rest. Which brings us, finally, to way 6, less a specific tactic than the idea sitting underneath the other 5. Every one of those plays is really the same move: use other people's money to control an asset you couldn't buy outright, and let the asset do the heavy lifting. Real estate, businesses, portfolios, cheap rate arbitrage, tax-advantaged loans, strip away the details and it's one motion. Borrow. Pointed at something that grows or pays. Let time compound the gap. And it stretches beyond the 5 I've named. A degree that genuinely lifts your income can be good debt, big if there, though, since the income actually has to show up. $40,000 borrowed for a nursing credential that adds $30,000 a year to your paycheck is one of the best trades on this entire list. $40,000 borrowed for a degree that lands you right back at your old job is just a very expensive participation trophy. Then there's seller financing, where the person selling a business lets you pay them over time straight out of the profits, same principle, minus the bank in the room. A franchise loan, a credit line against equipment that earns more than it costs, different costume every time, one idea underneath. So here's the one-sentence test I promised at the start, the whole video compressed into a question you can ask yourself standing in the checkout line: is this borrowed money buying me an asset or a liability? Is it about to put money into my pocket, or pull it out? That's the entire framework. The boat you've been eyeing is a liability. A duplex is an asset. That watch is a liability. A profitable business is an asset. Rate and terms matter, but that first question decides almost everything. And I have to be straight with you, because this is exactly where these kinds of videos start lying. You can do all of this correctly and still lose. We love celebrating the people who leverage their way to a fortune and quietly forget the ones who leveraged their way into a crater. For every Mason, there's a shadow version who bought at the wrong time, borrowed too much, hit a bad stretch, and got flattened. The market's long-term winners are rarer than you'd think. Research shows more than half of individual stocks actually lose money over their entire lifetime. Even the guru behind the debt is dumb gospel that Walter lives by went personally bankrupt from real estate leverage in his 20s. He's not wrong about the danger, he's just describing a different appetite for risk than the one that builds wealth quickly. So how do you land on Mason's side of the ledger instead of the wreckage side? For conditions, and a good debt play needs all 4. 1. The spread has to be real, the thing you're buying has to reasonably out-earn the loan. 2. It has to be an appreciating or cash-flowing asset, not a depreciating toy wearing an investment costume. 3. The leverage has to be survivable, with enough cushion that a bad year bends you instead of snapping you. 4. You have to keep making the payments through the rough patches, because the rough patches always come, and the loan, unlike you, never gets tired, never sleeps in, and never once feels bad about it. Miss any one of those 4 conditions, and good debt quietly turns back into the kind that's trying to kill you. And look, Walter isn't a fool. He got real things right. He never paid a cent of credit card interest. He saved every month. He sleeps just fine at night. If you're carrying high-interest consumer debt right now, Walter's whole cautious gospel is exactly the medicine you need first, before a single idea in this video. But he mistook avoiding debt for building wealth, and those are not the same project. The $30,000 he kept so safely tucked in savings had crept up to about $34,000 a decade later, and after inflation took its cut, it actually bought less than the day he first parked it. He guarded that money so carefully it quietly shrank in his hands. Mason took that same cautious instinct and aimed it at assets instead, turning one $50,000 down payment into $180,000 in equity, then repeated the move 5 more times. Same street, same paycheck, same starting line. One of them retired at 50 with 6 properties and a business that runs without him. The other has a paid-off house, a flawless credit score, and a quiet, nagging sense that he did everything right and somehow still got lapped. The difference was never courage, or luck, or income. Debt is just a tool. In the wrong hands, it's a trap that eats people alive. In the right hands, aimed at the right thing, it's the closest thing to a cheat code that ordinary people are actually allowed to use. If you want to learn to aim it like Mason instead of fearing it like Walter, that's exactly what we're building together inside our school community. I'll see you in the next one.